It is my pleasure to welcome you to the last Haskayne hour for this academic year. I am Yrjö Koskinen, Associate Dean of Research and Business Impact at Haskayne School of Business. In Haskayne hour, we combine faculty experts with business professionals to provide you with unique insights. Today's topic is, are platforms dominating society? Do we all use Amazon? Amazon, never heard of it. What's that? Oh, this topic couldn't be more exciting and important as we have grown ever more dependent on platforms during the COVID pandemic. As we broadcast from Calgary, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising of the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nation, and the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspore, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Please join us by acknowledging the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples in your own locations. I'm looking forward to a lively discussion today. We have the Q&A open, and we encourage you to type in your questions and comments anytime. You may also upvote the questions you want to get answered. The moderator for this event is Catherine Heckerud, Haskayne Business Technology Instructor and Teaching Fellow, and also Director of Strategic Initiatives. And I'm also happy to announce that Catherine has been promoted to Senior Instructor starting July 1st. Catherine, well done, well deserved. So Catherine, have we grown too dependent on platforms through the pandemic?
Well, Yrjö, thank you so much for the warm welcome and super exciting conversation, I think, today. So yes, major platforms like Amazon and Alibaba, is it possible to challenge their dominance? Or actually, would we even want to? I mean, if you think about it, platforms have changed the way we work, we shop, we eat. Where would we be without Skip the Dishes in the middle of a pandemic? And so perhaps some of these things are for better or for worse, right? So how are the benefits of centralized control and the facilitation of work that platforms provide us, how are they used? What are those benefits? But there's also, what about that impact to privacy and trust? So those are some of the topics we're going to explore today in our Haskayne hour. And so now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our presenters. Maureen Higgins is the IT advisory leader at E&Y. She has an extensive industry career that spans a variety of oil and gas, telecommunication, and financial services, and experienced in really translating those conceptual ideas into growth and operational savings opportunities for corporations. And also with us today is our distinguished research professor, Dr. Barrie Nault. He is a distinguished professor in our business and technology management area, and his current and past work looks at platforms, alliances, organizational forms, and productivity. So as we start this conversation today, we also want to hear from the audience. So as Yrjö mentioned, drop those questions into the Q&A and upvote them. But we're also going to launch with a little bit of a poll to see how you feel about platforms. Okay. So we'll give everybody just a few minutes to quickly weigh in on how many platforms you use each week. And then we're going to hear from Barrie on sort of a working definition of platforms and how the role they play in society plays out. Barrie, welcome.
Thank you, Catherine. Well, as you mentioned, platforms are ubiquitous in society, and I think we think that we see them everywhere. Just looking at how the poll numbers keep moving along here. And I think it becomes tough to actually define what a platform is and what a platform isn't. Certainly, we are finding that they have become a dominant way of organizing certain industries and certain activities. But this dominance leads to the possibility of this winner-take-all, where you see these very dominant platforms like Amazon and retailing, Facebook and social media. And I think this winner-take-all possibility of dominance, poses benefits, opportunities. It also poses some problems. there's issues of privacy. Who has the data? How can it be managed? How would it be used? So when I think about platforms, this is the way that I think about it. Maureen, how about you? How do you think about platforms?
Thanks, Barry. It's really an intriguing question, isn't it? Because I think as Catherine started off our conversation today, you know, has COVID really changed how we integrate with platforms and how we think about platforms? I think what I would say is that there's no doubt that platforms are becoming more prevalent in our everyday lives, mostly because they make our lives more efficient and more effective. But I think the other side is that I've also seen platforms not just become more prominent in my own life, but also from a corporation's perspective. We see that platforms are becoming more and more available to organizations to help them become more efficient and effective, help their employees become more efficient and effective. And I think a great example is in the collaboration space, where we've seen companies like Zoom and Teams become, you know, hardly ever used to really, I don't think there's a day that goes by without using these platforms, even on the weekend when you want to connect with family and friends. So I think for sure that we're seeing this surgence continue to come alive, not just in our own lives, but in corporate lives. And I guess my question is really, are platforms really being successful as far as making our lives more efficient and effective in the organizations we work in and helping us with our collaboration? Catherine?
Yeah, thanks, Maureen. Thanks, Barry. I think you brought up some really interesting points that I think might be sort of interesting to explore a little bit. And just before we do that, I'd love it if we could share the results of the poll, because I think this is quite insightful. You know, and it looks like I'm seeing, you know, sort of a spread here between around 33, you know, a third of folks say they're using 1 to 2, another third, maybe a little bit more. You know, certainly very few folks in that more than 10 category. But as I heard both of you talk, I sort of thought, oh, maybe there's more to this than just Facebook and Amazon. So Maureen, in your experience, what are some of those workplace platforms you mentioned? You know, you mentioned Zoom, but do they go beyond? Is it just the social media things we think about, or are there other sort of workplace platforms that we may not be contemplating in our count of platforms we're including?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it, Catherine, that as we start to think through platforms, that I think they've become so integrated into our day-to-day lives, we don't even think about them as platforms. So, you know, if you just do a common Google search, you'll find that Google is a platform. Microsoft, I think, is one that we probably all use. If you're not on Zoom, you're typically on Teams. Our ERP systems and corporations, so that's an energy resource planning enterprise resource planning tools like an SAP or an Oracle. Those are platforms. When we also think about kind of mid-sized players, one that is very prevalent is ServiceNow. So if you're in an organization and you have to access your help desk, often you're putting a ticket through from your computer. That's a platform. And then we also have some niche players out there, which would be typically for, you know, we've seen them for health and safety, we've seen them for GIS solutions. But again, I think some of those are really just starting to come into the platform play, because they recognize that no different than an Amazon, the more I can connect through my platform, obviously the more efficient and effective that platform will be.
Great sort of overview. And that actually twigged on one thing for me. And you talked about health platforms, and maybe we're just moving into this space. I mean, Barrie, data privacy concerns when we start thinking about health platforms and what that might look like. It's probably more than health, but.
I think there's a lot of this. You know, this is a little bit of like, what is old is new again. We've seen these waves in technology. Say it again.
Is that you and me? What is old?
Yeah, well, I like to think we're renewed periodically. But I think what we're seeing, you know, when you talk about the corporate and the government kind of platforms that are being implemented, and it seems like re-engineering of about 20 years ago, where you would actually bring in new software, and even the enterprise resource planning systems were new software early in 2000s when they were bringing them into change organizations. They would change where the decisions were made. They would change where the data was kept. They would change who had access to the data to make decisions. And so I think that has had a really big impact on how we look at our data privacy when it comes to big organizations, when we're an employee, or when we're a resident of a province and dealing with a healthcare system. I'm not really sure how we should be concerned about this, whether it's a concern that there's sufficient security inside these big new platform systems that are used in government and in firms, or whether we should be worried about the privacy of our data there. What do you think, Maureen? What's your experience here?
Yeah, I hate to use always the word worried, but I think we should be informed and I think we should be aware. So, as we sit here in our world, we know that as we have our day jobs, the people who are hacking systems have a day job too, and that day job is to hack systems, right? So as much as we'd like to think that the security is done and dusted when a platform is launched, I think that those platform owners are always having to continue to review and refresh their security. But also, I think the onus is on us to make sure that we understand, especially in the privacy area, where our data is exposed. And I know that often, it's, again, much simpler, and we'll pick on Amazon because I think a lot of people use it, but, when you could just buy it now because all my information is in there. I put a lot of trust in Amazon to make sure that my data is secure. But at the same time, I also need to be aware that if there is a breach, what am I going to do? How am I going to protect myself? And maybe even before that, am I making sure that I have, complex passwords, which are usually greater than 15 characters, including, a variety of capital, small, special characters. So there's things that we can do also as consumers and change that password often. But I also think that's no different than at a corporation, where the onus is also, again, even though corporations have policies, again, it's really important to make sure that you're following those policies, make sure you have that complex password, that you're changing it on a regular basis, that you're not sharing your password to other people, because again, you never know what's going to happen. And also that the corporation is managing access to that platform appropriately as well.
So Maureen,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Catherine.
No, I was just going to say, so, when I hear you guys talk about that, I'm thinking about, external threats to privacy, right? The security, are we changing our passwords? How are organizations firewall protecting our data? And, but I think, isn't there also maybe a concern around even just that use within the organization? So, we love, Netflix, Amazon, the algorithms that recommend those things to us, but that's really because they're mining our data all the time. Is there, sort of that other side to that dark side of the use of that data mining piece that the corporations are doing? Do we have any concerns about that?
Well, I think that is a piece that corporations are grappling with too. I'm not sure. I know a lot of companies right now who are on the forefront, other than maybe the companies you've named that are more in that consumer space. But, if I think about a company that's downtown Calgary or in, downtown Toronto, I think that some of that is maybe on the cusp where they're trying to be, they're being more efficient and effective with their data, but I'm not sure they're necessarily mining that data for employee behavior. So, but I do think that there's a lot of potential to be mining data in organizations for patterns and to try to improve decision-making and really trying to help people be on the leading edge, right? So that they can have a competitive advantage. So I do think that mining data is really important. Barrie, you probably have better insights as far as that consumer side.
Well, I think, let me just stay with the corporate side for a moment. My sense is this is the purpose of analytics. We've seen the explosion in academic programs and of analytics. And, most of our students who graduate, they go into organizations that are not necessarily retail organizations. And so I do wonder, there's certainly a great use of analytics inside firms to deal with their customers, even when their customers are not individuals. The customers are other firms and their suppliers, which are also other firms. And I really hadn't thought about the privacy of my customers' information or my suppliers' information when it comes to those customers and suppliers being firms rather than individuals. Is there any sense that this needs to be protected the same way?
I would, I think that when we start to look at privacy, I think there was a bill C-17, I believe is the bill number, where they're starting to look in Canada to move more towards the GTRP hopefully I got that acronym right, the same privacy that's over in the UK, which I think now requires people to make sure they're opting out versus assuming everybody's opting in. But it also puts a lot more rigor on corporations, on the type of information that you, and again, I'm not an expert in this field, so I'll speak generally, and I apologize if I don't have it quite right. But it's really important to make sure that you as a corporation have the certain requirements and controls in place around that data. So Barrie, I think to your point that, we often separate the privacy to be individuals versus corporations. But I think that as we continue to move ahead and have a lot more exposure to our personal and our corporate information, that those worlds are going to start to blend and it's going to, or to blur, and it's going to be really hard to say that was just personal and that's just corporate. So therefore, you don't need to worry. GDPR, thank you.
GDPR, yeah. So actually, this is a great, and it ties to one of the questions we've had in the chat. So, we mentioned this sort of large scale, our students are maybe going into big corporations where they have capacity. But one of the questions in the chat is, great conversation so far. I would love to know thoughts on how small Canadian businesses have a fighting chance against retail giants like Amazon. Will they need to use Amazon to sell their products? And if they're standing a platform independently, how do they cope with GDPR in terms of reporting requirements and so on? Like, I think it's an interesting question for our small business folks in the crowd today. Any thoughts?
Barrie, I think, has a thought.
There you go. So actually, I'd like to offer something to this. So we actually didn't plant this question, but one of my PhD students, Mason Ferraduni, very clever guy, and he and I are working together, and we have some work on what we call shared platforms like ShopRunner. So one of the problems when you sell through Amazon is you have to run your sales through their standardized process. And so you really don't have as much marketing that you have control over. You don't even really have the way that you would display your products on Amazon in the way that you might like to otherwise. And there are some alternative platforms which provide some services, maybe things like free shipping, but they allow you to put your marketing on that platform and the way that you set up your relationships on that platform. And the advantage of that is that you get to keep what you've got in terms of your presence without giving it away to Amazon. And you have the opportunity to form something like a horizontal alliance with a lot of other retailers that might use the same platform. We should recognize that at some level, Amazon is horizontal integration. So they're integrating across product lines. So not vertically, but across product lines, so that they are the one-stop shop online for almost all retail products. And a horizontal alliance could do the same thing if it was the individual sellers setting themselves up to do that. The other side of that kind of platform would be that many of us may choose to have a membership in that platform, something like Amazon Prime, but with this platform that allows a horizontal alliance. So there are ways, I think, for small businesses to compete, but it's taking a while for that to take shape. And I would say they're followers, but they're pretty fast followers at the moment. What do you think, Maureen? Have you seen that kind of thing?
I haven't. I haven't. I think that when I'm looking at a corporation, the adoption of platforms, it's there, but it's probably not quite obviously as extensive as it is from an Amazon perspective. But, I think what dawned on me when you were sharing that was it goes back to that first, your conversation initially to introduce platforms, which, as a marketplace, you probably want more people in that marketplace than less, right? So for people in small business who are, opting to use different marketplaces, different platforms, the challenge for them is how do they actually create that volume, right? How do they create the exposure to their customers and their future customers? Do these platforms, Barrie, come with some additional marketing services as well to help out these individuals to get their brand known?
So I think they offer certain kind of value-added services. As I said, free shipping has been one of the key ones that has shown up in the past, but they can offer different things. You can certainly behave like a third-party provider as a platform. And on the other side, because they have customers that get memberships, in a sense, you're growing both sides. the
Right.
platform. You're growing the side that has different retailers that would like to be present there. And then you have different customers that would like to be members of that.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I think from the corporate side, the other thing that's becoming really interesting is the exposure of the corporate platform to their vendors and suppliers. So as much as, when we started off, it's about efficiency and effectiveness, and often we think it's down and in within a corporation, platforms are actually making that surge to start to go out. So again, it's much simpler for the organization to reach out to those suppliers, and again, expanding that platform so that there's more and more individuals on the platform, which again is, helpful when you're creating that marketplace. It's just a different type of marketplace as far as versus retail. It's more corporate focused.
Yeah, the synergies there seem very similar, don't they? And I like the example that you just gave, because it says that, I'd like to think about this in terms of a gaming platform, even though I'm not a gamer, but on a gaming platform like Xbox or PlayStation, you've got gamers and you have providers of game software, and there's a synergy, that goes on there.
Absolutely.
Speaking of synergies and in gamers and game providers in that sort of two-sided platform, we had a great question from the audience, and it was around Etsy. And vendors went on strike for a week, April 11th to April 18th, to protest increasing fees. What does that indicate about the market power of retailing platforms, and how do platforms like Shopify or other offer different channels? So, does this suggest greater choice and independence as consumers and businesses with the increasing number of platforms, or are we locked in more than ever, especially when platforms like Amazon and Wayfair don't even try to be profitable, in their platform business? So lots to unpack there, but so clearly these small vendors on the Etsy platform selling their shop, went on strike so any reaction to that?
Well, I think this is a pretty interesting tussle. I was speaking to a colleague in Germany about 2 weeks ago, and he was saying he spoke to a president of a dog food company. And this president was very frustrated because it looked like the only place they could sell their dog food was through Amazon. And I responded that I have a dog, as many of us do, and sometimes I shop around for my dog food if I can't go in person, as we've seen during COVID times. And you'll find individual websites that cater to that segment, like pets. So we actually have, I believe it's in Alberta, a company called Homes Alive Pets that started out of Edmonton. And I went and found dog food on there for probably 15% cheaper than I could have found it on Amazon. And so I think there's still going to be a tussle between, I'll use in this example, the dog food manufacturer might be, I don't want to give a name away, but there's some dog food manufacturer, and then the retailers that they're going to, sell their products through, and the deals that they provide to those retailers. And, probably some ability to act as a bulwark against Amazon dictating prices, right? Because we do see that even though it doesn't look like Amazon dictates prices, in many ways we believe they do.
And I think that's no different if you think from a corporate perspective. Catherine, I love the comment about, or you end up by being handcuffed into that platform, right? And I think that, when you're the corporate world, you always have to make those decisions, and you have to say, who am I actually going to put, my eggs in the basket? It doesn't mean you can't have multiple platforms, because you can, but obviously you want to make sure that those platforms are probably serving different purposes, because it's all just about cost, right, and efficiency. And you want to make sure that you're being the most effective from a cost perspective in your organization that you can be. But unfortunately, in the corporate world, often you do have to pick a horse, and you do have to ride it to the end of the race. The end of the race can be dictated, though, by a few things. And platforms, I think, are going to also change that a little bit. Used to be when you bought some software, you had to upgrade it at certain periods of time. And sometimes that software would go end of life, and that would be a decision for you to then maybe reevaluate the software. It'll be interesting to see what happens in platforms, because, my take is that platforms are just going to be continuing, evolving and growing. And I'm not sure that they are going to ever have an end of life. And Barrie, I don't know if you have experience where of a platform that's died recently. And so like, what does that start to look like? And I think it's a really interesting question for people and for organizations.
And we have a great question about this actually in the chat, if I may. Just is the interaction and possible integration across, commercial platforms changing the dynamics of organizational risk assessment, management, and economic risk exposure for both the platform themselves and for the various users? So, I think, Maureen, you talked about this idea of corporations going, we haven't seen it go end of life with a platform like we have maybe historically with, on-premise software. Is the dynamic changing here in this organizational risk assessment and decision-making frameworks? What do you think?
I think so. And I think that we've seen an uptick, especially at third-party risk management. Just recently, I think previously, it was a notion that companies were getting into. It was, I shouldn't say within the last 10 years, time flies too much, right? So, 10 years ago, it was kind of like, yeah, this notion was coming and people were evaluating their third parties. I think now, because of the integration into that third party, it's much harder to get rid of that party too, right? So once they become part of your organization and you become part of theirs, it just takes a little bit more energy to unwind it than it is if it's just I'll call it a paper transaction, right? Where they're sending you an invoice on a regular basis and vice versa. I sit in some conversations, I was going to say the company name, but caught myself. And, one thing that came up was that they have the ability to, because of their cybersecurity, they have the ability to run some software on their vendors around cyber risk. And it's interesting because I think, again, another thing that pops up is, that's really cool, but if you find out that a vendor you're dealing with has certain risk associated to it, and then you choose to turn a blind eye, or you mention this to the party and they don't do anything about it, what risk does that open up to you in the event of something happening, right? So I think why I share that is because I think the world is becoming so interconnected with our vendors and our suppliers and ourselves that, companies really do need to be thoughtful about what are their practices in this space and how are they going to mitigate that risk. And I'm not sure ignorance is a defense either.
Barrie, anything you want to add to Maureen's?
Indeed, and I think one element of the risk that Maureen has raised before is the risk that your third-party vendor now has access to the information that your customers thought was only residing with the focal company. Mm-hmm. And as a consequence, maybe the focal company, in a sense, being a channel for that risk, puts them in a position where they need to be much more careful about their third parties. If we go back to our gaming example, which is probably the one that would be most familiar to many people, or at least easiest to model mentally, I don't know. So since I'm not a gamer, but I don't know if I'm using a game that is written by a game software developer, are they keeping data on what I'm doing, as well as the platform such as Xbox? Are they keeping data on what I'm doing? And so as Xbox somehow have either some responsibility in a legal sense or responsibility in a moral sense for somehow protecting my data as it goes through that channel. And I could see corporations doing this all the time. I mean, for example, if I'm a supplier to your firm, I'm not sure I want that many people to know it. I don't want that to be public information. Right? Yeah. I don't want my pricing to you to be public information.
Absolutely. And we have another little quick poll for the audience around privacy and security. So maybe we can throw that up and just get people's perspective on how comfortable they are. Because, I think Barrie, you sort of highlighted here, we want to play the games. Maybe I'm not a gamer either, but we're invested in the games. We like hearing about whether it's, or my Amazon experience. I like the recommendations that Amazon provides me, but how comfortable am I with that kind of information being shared? And we may not know it's moving out to a third party, right? I shared it with Amazon, but, are they sharing that beyond their virtual walls, right? So we'll see here what the audience has to say on convenience versus security. But I think that's a really interesting insight that we don't know where it's going and how comfortable we are. So
hey, Catherine, can I just comment on that?
Yeah,
I think that's the one thing too that again, I think we all get very comfortable. So if you're working in a corporation, companies spend a lot of money on cybersecurity for those reasons, right? To make sure that their information is secure, when they're interacting with that third party, you know, obviously that connection needs to be really secure. But to your point, there sometimes can be a naiveness, especially on companies that are maybe new to the platform, maybe new to their, you know, just don't have the maturity around the cybersecurity space. And I do think that that's a risk that again, back to that awareness piece at the beginning that I talked about, that, you know, corporations and people need to be really understand where is my data going and who has my data. And unfortunately, a lot of that awareness is on the consumer, right? And it should be, especially in that marketplace. But also, I just want to make sure that people don't get the wrong impression that companies are certainly spending a lot of money on cybersecurity. That's, I can attest to that for many angles. But I do think that at the end of the day, with all this connectivity, there's somewhere chances of there being a weak link just continue to grow.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And if we could just share the results, and I think you'll see from these results that people are not necessarily comfortable. So, and
yeah.
I think that's sort of insightful. And, Barrie, I was thinking as you were talking about the dog food, and, do we just gravitate then to Amazon because we believe we have more trust? One of the questions that we have right now, in a winner-take-all scenario like Amazon, what is the relationship between Amazon using consumers' data and barriers to entry for other firms? And, would increased entry make data more secure? So, are those smaller platforms less secure? I don't know that that's necessarily true, but do we have more comfort because it's Amazon and we believe that there's more going on? I don't know. Barrie, what do you think?
Thanks, Catherine. One of the problems I believe we face in this is it's difficult to assess as a consumer or even a corporate customer. It's difficult to assess your risk. So you can assess it perhaps with the organization you're dealing with, but it's not clear that organization is impregnable when it comes to data leakage. And so it's difficult. So it depends on your level of risk aversion in terms of how much you're willing to do. Convenience is a big thing, though. And we might remember many years ago, I think it was Amazon that patented the one-click purchase. So we know that convenience has value. One of the ways that the European Union, through their regulation, that one of the questions we had earlier referred to, this GDPR regulation, one aspect of that regulation is data portability. And we've got a couple of colleagues here, Varun Vijay Raghavan and Human Hadaji, who have been working on how to understand how firms should handle data portability and what the impact of some of these regulations is going to be. So the data portability regulation that I'm referring to is the one where firms are going to be required to allow customers to access their data in a portable form so they could take it to another platform. So they could access their data from Amazon, download that data, and then bring it over to Facebook or whatever alternative platform they would like. The analysis of that so far is showing that this is likely to backfire. Because it's likely to backfire because more capable platforms tend to have wider and potentially more valuable offerings for you. And so you might port your data from a smaller platform that you just historically had some relationship with, and you'll take it and then you'll move it to one of the larger platforms. So there's some possibility that that will actually reinforce the problem that they're trying to solve with data portability. Another aspect of data portability is I can port my data, but I don't own it. So it doesn't mean the platform that I'm porting it from has to delete it. So there's quite a few features in here that are evident. And I wonder, Maureen, how do firms think about who owns the data that they have on other firms? So who owns the data? If your customer buys something from you, mm-hmm. and you record that purchase, do they own it? Do you own it? Do you both own it?
If I answer that, I'll probably get myself in hot water because I don't think I really know the answer. But it's a good question, Barrie. It's a good question. And I think, there's smarter people in the world who could answer it. I do think, though, regardless of who owns it, I would suspect that if I have your data, I have some sort of obligation to make sure that it is secure in my environment, whether I own it or not. But again, that would just be, me thinking through that out loud.
We have another sort of question related to Amazon here in the chat. It seems that Amazon and other FANG firms bumps down Amazon.ca search rankings if a firm does not use its cloud or other services. And Amazon is expanding horizontally, eliminating competition and innovation every time. It just vanished. Every time. Hang on. Every time. Every time, sorry about that. And Amazon is expanding horizontally, eliminating competition and innovation every time they expand. How can Canadian tech firms grow when they are faced with 5 big firms that eliminate nascent competition in this way? So do you think it's possible for Canadian tech, right? We've got this booming this tech sector in Calgary. What do you think? Is it possible for us to grow?
Well, I think it's possible.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Barrie.
So, I mean, I think part of being bumped down on Amazon if you don't use their cloud, for example, is it's really a charge for prominence. And so we're seeing, most retail platforms have these charges for prominence, whereby, if you use their services or you pay an additional fee, you will become more prominent. That's the whole point of sponsored search, right? It's sponsored because there's an auction in the background that you're paying to have your product or your advertisement, elevated to be more prominent on the website. Amazon is just doing that with cloud and other services that you might be able to provide. And so I think I'll go back to this, what's old is new again. Prominence is not new for those of us who remember when airlines reservation systems first showed up at our travel agents. And it would be either American Airlines in the US or United Airlines in the US that had those initial systems. And one of the problems with the systems for their competitors were, as your travel agent would look up all of the flights, and of course we're all our own travel agents now through some Expedia, and we see we've offloaded this job to us. The order of the flights would favor the company that had the airline's reservation systems. And there was actually a lot of court cases in the United States about antitrust when it came to these airlines reservation systems. And then they ended up having to divest part of it. They ended up having to change their policies. And so this has been used as a competitive weapon before. I'm not sure why it isn't seen the same way now.
And I would probably flip that on its head a little bit too, just back to your question about competitiveness, Catherine, which is, I think that with every problem becomes, someone's going to solve it and potentially disrupt what's happening today. So even though there may be sponsored searches and all those good things, somebody out there is going to crack that nut, and somebody out there is going to say, hey, instead of doing that, let's actually solve the problem this way. And before we know it, we could be sitting here and, a year from now and saying, oh, remember that they used to have that thing called sponsored searches, but they don't anymore if you go to XYZ because they've addressed it. So I just think it's another opportunity for some bright individual out there to flip this one on its head.
Wonderful, wonderful. We have a more personal question that I'm curious if you're willing to share with us. The question is, what platforms are Maureen and Barrie comfortable using, and what protections do you personally take? And we had another one around LinkedIn, and it was, the IT security team at my former company told me that the platform leading to the highest amount of identity theft is LinkedIn. Are there some platforms that are considered more vulnerable than others? So maybe what you're not on is what we should consider more vulnerable.
Yeah, I mean, I think LinkedIn was very much in the papers a couple of years ago with them selling to, was it Cambridge Analytics and all those good things. So, but I also think, again, to me, it's, I think if I shared the platforms I'm on, it's probably a moot point, because first of all, people would probably be, I'm probably on the oldest platforms, not the newest ones. But I think that, again, the moral of the story is simply, you really have to be aware of what is your, what's the word for your preferences, your configuration that you click when you enter these platforms. How much information do you expose? Do you put on, don't they say you only need 3 pieces of information You need like a name, a birth date, and something else. And with those 3 pieces of information, you can pretty much, get theft, identity theft. And I think that's the thing about Facebook is, as much as that makes Facebook sound like terribly risky, at the same time, if you look, most people put that type of information on their Facebook page. Therefore, it makes it a no-brainer that that's where people would go if they want to do identity theft, right? So I don't think it's necessarily a slam on the company. I think it's just that people don't appreciate that the information they're exposing is exactly the information that people need. And for me personally, when I use a platform, I really do check the preferences. I make sure that I don't get a lot of automatic updates or sync my data. I never tell the platform to remember me with my password. I always make sure my password is 15 characters or more. So those are more of the tips and tricks I use versus the platforms that I engage with. Barrie?
Fabulous. Thanks, Maureen. Barrie? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Maureen. I use a couple of those strategies as well. The other strategy that I use is I try to, as often as I can when I'm using a platform, to go in as a guest. So I'm not putting in information. If they ask me, if I make a purchase, do they want me to keep the credit card on file? I certainly don't. I cannot assure that they're not doing it anyway, but I certainly don't have that feature as at least a minimum level of protection. I think in the initial stages of e-commerce, it wasn't obvious that the credit card companies were very comfortable having credit card used on e-commerce websites. I mean, you're thinking about the late 1990s, early 2000s, where there were different kinds so it wasn't a Bitcoin, but it was like Mondex and some other kinds of money, rather than being able to use your credit card. And it took a while for the credit card companies, I think, both to put themselves in a position where they had enough security, and in a sense, they had to offer some level of if a purchase is made on your credit card and you didn't authorize it, maybe the credit card company is responsible for it. They also have algorithms in the background to examine whether this pattern is different than the pattern that you normally have. I remember driving across the United States from the Midwest to Calgary, and somewhere in Montana, it refused my credit card because it thought it wasn't me, because I hadn't driven through Montana in that direction in my history. And so those protections are at least, put in that way. It's not extensive, but it gives you some feeling that you've got some protection.
Excellent, thanks. So we've got a couple more questions emerging. So one, do you believe there's a generational difference in comfort sharing personal information and privacy? Sort of what's your experience in that space?
I'm not sure it's generational. I do think that people who have, I'll say, grown up with platforms are probably more comfortable with them. But I would say that there are people of my generation that I know, back to my earlier comment, that don't think twice about what they click and how they set their profiles up on platforms, what information they disclose. Yes, save my password. Yes, save my credit card, because it's all back to that convenience piece. So I'm not sure it's generational. I think it's just kind of people's own risk tolerance, perhaps. And maybe some people don't really even think about it. They just do it. So maybe it's not even an overt risk tolerance. Barrie, what are your thoughts?
No, I agree. And I think there's also a cultural piece of this. I know, depending on everybody's background, we're all different in that way. So I'm not going to say what generation I'm from, but there's probably some clues. But there's always this joke in some generation, and some Canadians, but mostly Americans, who will say, we're the government, we're here to help you, and you start to laugh because there's an issue of trust with big organizations. And I think the people who are from that culture and that generation cultural mix, you probably are much more wary of what happens on platforms than the generation that has grown up with them. I guess part of it is also whether you've been exposed to having your identity stolen, or having somebody that with their identity stolen. I know somebody who had their identity stolen, and it took them 5 years to unwind it. And this is a sharp lesson.
Yes.
Right? Actually, a car was bought with their credit card and things like this. And there was other things as well. So look, there is a danger. I guess the issue is, well, if the danger is only hitting 0.5% of the population, maybe the other 99.5% of us are home free, but there is a danger.
Right, right. So, you talked a little bit about some of the recommendation systems and how you guys maybe don't share that much data. We have another question. As a consumer, I love a recommender system, but I don't like to share my personal information. Is it possible then for me to even have, engage with the platform in a meaningful way? Thoughts?
Well, it's really tough with personalized pricing, right? So there are advantages of recommendation systems. And I think that it would be very difficult if somebody said, I never use them, but I use Amazon, it'd be very difficult for them to tell you they've never scrolled to the bottom of the screen and seen what's recommended. And that is a recommendation system, even maybe not as elaborate as some others. It's a trade-off. And one of the things that we have found has been implemented more often than we realize is retailers using personalized pricing to provide you, to make more profit for them and to customize it for you. Sometimes that customization is in your favor. Sometimes that customization is not. It's subtle. So for example, when you receive an email from a platform that says, if you do this, you can get 10% off now. It's probably not the universe of customers of that platform that are getting that email. And so there's lots of subtle ways that these couponing methods are implementing personalized pricing. There was once a statement by one of the executives at Safeway, I think it might have been Safeway in the US, said, at some point, you're going to have a personalized price for everything when you walk into our store. Based on your history, based on where we think we can make the most profit and keep you the most happy, as a combination of those two things. So I think we need to be aware of it. We don't need to be scared of it. We just need to be aware of it. Right. Maureen, what do you think?
No, I agree. I think you said exactly right. This is really all about, the end of the day, the awareness piece, right? Whether you're a person or corporation, you just need to be aware of what's happening, who has your data. Transactions. I do think you can still leverage platforms without sharing a lot of information, but then to Barrie's point, you're not probably getting the benefit out of those platforms that you could. So it's a trade-off.
One of the earlier questions we had, and I kind of kept it in the back of my mind because I didn't answer it, was how do startups in the platform space compete with the other big platforms? One of the ways it seems like there's the most possibility for success is to have kind of an industry-based platform. And so in a sense, the more differentiated the underlying products that you're selling on the platform, the more possibility there is for you to have a platform that provides a little bit more service for that differentiated good. So for example, the dog food and pet supply example might be one where, a website that really caters to that will provide a differentiated service as compared to what an Amazon would.
Right.
So I think that's a space where it's possible. I guess there's nothing new about being differentiated can work to your advantage, but it's worth implementing that idea in this context. I'm sure we're seeing this in the corporate world too, right? In Calgary. Yeah,
I mean, I would say that there's a couple of opportunities where organizations are really looking for digital workplace, right? And so how can I make my work environment, again, more efficient for my employees, everything from helping push out emails to work orders, to letting them have notification of certain alerts that pertain to them. So it's very much like a customized little placemat that you have on your own computer. But, the pace of that is a little bit slow because, again, you're looking for people who are first movers in the space, and there's not necessarily a lot of them. But what's happening is probably even in the last 8 months to a year that they're starting to, percolate and bubble up. And so now it's becoming more, I wouldn't say me, but
I think we may have lost Maureen's audio there for a second.
Yeah. Did we lose Maureen's audio?
Am I back?
Yeah.
Yes, you are now.
Yes, you're back. Yay.
All right. Yay. I'm back. So anyways, yes. Next question. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that great conversation. And actually, just before we sort of move towards, I'm mindful of the time, everybody's time, but Barrie, you touched on something, and I just want to sort of highlight that a little bit, right? We talked about credit cards. And I mean, if I think about it, credit cards are one of the earliest platforms that we have huge trust in. And so do you think as we sort of move along, over the next 20, 30 years, we'll just be more comfortable thinking about platforms generally? Will they just become ingrained in our daily use? What do you guys think?
I think so. And one thing that popped up for me the other day, so trying to get into the 20s, I was loading a credit card into my digital wallet on my Apple phone. And I was very pleased with myself because I thought, well, I'm going to do this and that'll make my life so much easier. And then there was a disclaimer that popped up before I hit enter, which was the bank was saying, because you're now taking this information and putting it into this digital wallet, we are not liable, basically. And so I didn't proceed because I thought, I don't know, maybe I'm just too old school in that sense, but I thought, maybe it's just not just yet. Maybe I need to wait another 6 months and see if there's something else that organizations can do. But I think it's just one of those things that stopped me a little bit in my tracks to say, yeah, I think that they are going down that path, but there's still a few things around the risk profile that for me, just caused me to stop and pause.
Yeah, Barrie, anything you want to sort of?
So I think that we've become much more aware over time that we are dealing with platforms. Platforms are typically characterized by the fact that there's a platform and then there's one side and there's the other side. And there's some synergies about this. Catherine, you might mention a bit more about this in a moment. And there is a question that I think came up in an earlier discussion that we've all had, which is, are you using the platform or is the platform using you?
Ooh.
And I think at least understanding that both of these are probably true puts you in a perspective where you are not a passive getter of good things from platforms. They're getting something too. And they're going to be running the analytics. They're going to be personalized pricing. They're going to be providing bias intermediation by showing you what they think you're going to like, which will be the best for them. There is a possibility of all this data being taken away without your knowledge. On the other hand, the convenience during COVID, I actually think platforms and the discipline that many of us work in has really been a hugely important piece of keeping the economy going during COVID, particularly during the first 6-month lockdown, because you couldn't get stuff. Now I know the supply chains got tangled up, but I think it's worth recognizing that, as I said, we use them and they use us in some sense, but the value that they've provided to our society in this time of crisis, of pandemic, I don't think we could have foreseen how important these would be.
I think that's a great point, Barrie, and I would echo that on the corporate side too, that those companies that weren't set up quite on Teams, got on Teams or Zoom or Google, to enable conversations to occur with their employees and their clients and their suppliers and their vendors. And, it's really changed how companies do business. But to your point, if it wasn't for this process, it would have been a lot harder to jump on your telephone and be calling everybody and conference calls. It wouldn't have been quite as intimate for that. I think that's really important on the relationship side.
Yeah. No, I think great observations. And I think the pandemic has absolutely changed the way we interact with platforms and our reliance on them. But I think, that sort of perspective of we're active participants in this and we benefit, and we have to be mindful of our relationship as well with the platforms and that trust. And I think that's a great reminder for all of us. On the call today. So I know we're getting near the end. There's a ton of questions left in the chat, but I'm just mindful of our time. So Uriel, are we back to you, or do I have time for one more question?
You have time for one more question.
One more question. Okay. So I'll look at another Amazon one. It looks like Amazon has become a platform of platforms. Interesting observation. For movies, TV shows. Now you can get a subscription to Starz, Discovery Plus, AMC Plus, etc. through Amazon. Do you expect this model will be used in other industries like music and gaming? So the platform of platforms.
Well, competition and takeovers, is not new. And I think about platforms that compete. So there's some work that a couple of colleagues, Ray Zhang and Jun Ma and I are working on, which is looking at how streaming platforms compete and whether they should be licensing their content with each other. During the pandemic, I think there's been a pretty big growth in Netflix and Disney. Disney moved to Disney Plus and some other things like that. And the contracts between them have changed as a consequence of that. So Disney pulled a bunch of its content from some of the other streaming platforms when they moved in Disney Plus. And so the degree to which there's competition between these platforms, and then, at some point there's consolidation. So we certainly see this in media. We see media consolidation. So I would agree with the person who posed the question. We're going to keep seeing this business model, but I'm not sure it's fundamentally different. Other than the platform structure, I don't think it's fundamentally different than what we may have seen already in the past. What do you think, Maureen?
I agree. I agree.
Yeah. Okay, so we're getting near the end. Uriel, I believe over to you. Thank you both, Maureen and Barrie, very much. Great conversation.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thanks for all the watchers and listeners.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today and for very active participation. We had about 64 participants on the webinar across Canada and beyond today. And a recording of today's program will be available on our website soon. There's a lot of interesting issues covered today. So, one of the major takeaways is that platforms do really provide tremendous value to society and us as consumers. We probably wouldn't have survived the pandemic without them. Think about life without Zoom or MS Teams at this point. It's not possible. Cybersecurity and privacy concerns are, of course, very serious concerns. Sorry about that. I had forgot to turn on my phone. Cybersecurity and privacy concerns are serious concerns, not only for individuals, but also for firms. And there is a trade-off between convenience and security. So a lot of people are not willing to share some personal details at the expense of convenience. However, people don't know the risks they are taking. So we should be perhaps more astute consumers and understanding what risks we are taking these days. Platforms do have a lot of market power, and there's always a tussle between platforms and vendors. Major antitrust issues are ever prevalent with unforeseeable consequences. And we always think about personal pricing. That's great, but that's unfortunately a sign of market power that these platforms have. Disruption is still possible. New platforms may emerge and dethrone old champions. And how do these new champions might emerge? Perhaps through differentiated services, offer a better product and more differentiation, better services, and then you might even challenge Amazon at some point. As a reminder, we will be hosting our next Haskayne Hour early next fall. So please remember to check your inbox for your invitation to join. However, we have a new host then, as my term as the Associate Dean is ending in 2 months' time. And this has been a great pleasure hosting the Haskayne Hour since the pandemic started online. I would like to remind you that you will be getting an evaluation survey in your email. Please look for it and send in your comments. And finally, thank you for our excellent panelists today, Barrie and Maureen, and our moderator, Catherine. We really appreciate your insightful discussions. And thank you all for joining us. I'm glad you were able to join us. We are looking forward to connecting with you again in the fall. Thank you. Bye-bye.